Welcome to our first lecture here on the ancient roots of Western civilization in our first week of Western Civ. Our first lecture here is on the origins of civilization. As we begin today, I'd like to have a bit of a devotional thought with you as we reflect upon history from a Christian perspective. What we find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is a fundamental belief of Christians and something that's greatly shaped Western civilization, this truth that's revealed to us in Scriptures. As we read on in Genesis chapter 1, we find in verse 27 that God not only made the earth and everything in it, but He also made man, and He made man in His own image. This is very significant for us as Christians, and it shapes what all develops in time as a result. As we continue in Genesis, we find that by the time we come to Genesis chapter 3, that people who are made in the image of God, with the capacity to have fellowship with Him, have been alienated from Him by sin. And in Genesis chapter 3, verse 14 and following, what we find is there are consequences for people having sinned. People were alienated from God, and instead of living in a world where everything was perfect, now people lived in a world where things were difficult. Survival was tough, and it's going to be by the sweat of their brow that they would struggle and survive. As people went on to live outside the Garden of Eden, and we come to Genesis chapter 4, what we find is that Cain established a city in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. Now, when it says that he lived in a city, it's not a city as you and I would think about it, but what I think it points to is that it's a defensive location where he's going to plan to live in a defended situation, and he's going to be a sedentarist, where he's going to stay in that place and live because there's sufficient resources for himself and his family, and it's a defensible location because, as you find in that text, he's afraid that somebody's going to kill him. But it's not a complicated city at that point in time, early on, but we're not told the specifics. What we do find in Genesis is that human society develops very quickly and is complicated from early on. And I think this is the result of the fact that people are made in the image of God. What we find in Genesis is not what people are going to generally think about when they come at this from a non-Christian perspective. But as we come here to study, I pray that this truth that we're made by God, this is His world, it's a real world, and one that He made that was very good, and one which people have damaged by their rebellion against Him, has shaped our society in many, many ways. We live in this world, and we struggle here, but we can have fellowship with God, and we can have fellowship with each other. But so often, in a fallen world, people are in competition for resources, and as a result, sometimes they fail to recognize that other people are made in the image of God, and they fail to recognize that they're answerable to God for their actions. I pray the Lord might bless you here today as we think about the origins of civilization. Now, as you've been reading in your textbook, what you found is that civilization is an interesting complex of material and immaterial culture shared by a large group of people over a period of time, a group of people that have social structures that help them to coexist in these large communities. The word civilization comes from a idea amongst the Romans, that of civitas, that people live in urban settings. In order for people to live together, there have to be shared values. And these shared values help them to live together and cooperate together. But how is it possible that people came to live in urban settings where they could live together in large communities? There's a number of theories on where civilizations come from, and as people live in different civilizations, there's some rivalry as people have different values with each other. The whole idea of Western civilization itself is one that was very popular some years ago, but has fallen into disfavor, and it's not politically correct these days. But Western civilization is a culture that you live in here as Americans, and It's one that's greatly shaped the society in which you live and which you need to understand as you interact in this country. And it gives you a basis upon which to understand yourself as you go and travel in other parts of the world. To study Western civilization in and of itself is not a essentially ethnocentric activity, as some might suggest. To understand yourself is very important as you seek to understand others. There's a whole lot of people who would presume to be ignorant of themselves, and the result is that they would run roughshod over others. But I hope this is going to help you to better understand yourself and the society in which you live, and help you to be a more effective person in this society. So let's go ahead and think about this again. Our definition of a civilization is a complex material and immaterial culture shared by a significant group of people who have social structures that help them to coexist in large communities in a world where everything's not perfect. So where does this complex come from? Western society, as other societies, has developed in response to circumstances here in this world. The theories on the emergence of civilizations vary in different ways, depending upon where you come from. There are some theological theories that these would be demonstrated in ancient writings, for example, amongst the pagans. They believed that the gods established certain civilizations, and the reasons why certain civilizations were dominant was because their gods were dominant. We find this kind of cosmogony, this explanation for origins, in ancient writings in cuneiform from Mesopotamia and in Egypt, where there are different patron gods of different cities, and they explain the world in terms of their gods creating the world and creating their cities and bringing them to dominance. Amongst other non-Christian theories would be that human society is something that just evolves by chance over time as people struggle to survive, and in a world that's sort of nasty and brutish, that people band together so that they can coexist and thrive in competition with other groups of people. That theory is not particularly theological, but it's one that reflects an understanding of a world without God. But for us as Christians, what we see is that civilizations depend in part upon the nature of people made in God's image. People made in God's image are creative. And as creative people, like God, we can respond to circumstances. We're not all powerful like God, but we can respond to circumstances in meaningful ways in a world that's real. And we can improve our situation to some extent, given our limitations. Now, beyond theological theories regarding the rise of civilization, there are observations that would be functional in nature, and much of this we can certainly agree with. Civilizations are something that develop as people are by nature somewhat gregarious. We like to be with other people. We're lonely when we're alone. We find that this is part of the nature of Adam, even as God was creating the world on day 6, that it was not good for Adam to be alone, and that God gave Adam Eve. We like to be with other people typically. Some of us are more gregarious than others. Some might think themselves loners, but yet at the same time what we find is that we need each other most all of the time. I see civilization developing in part as a creative response to life in a fallen world with depraved people. What we see from early on in Genesis is that out of jealousy, Cain killed Abel, and then subsequently he was afraid that other people might ignore the fact that he was made in the image of God and they might kill him. And so by banding together, people can protect each other and work together to use skills and abilities and time to produce food, even as they have to sweat to produce it, but that they might accumulate food that they need to fuel their bodies. And so I would see civilization as something of a necessary development in the history of mankind here in this world. When thinking about the emergence of civilizations, people like Spielvogel, our textbook writer, believe that this is something that developed very slowly over time, beginning about 5,000 years ago, and that this was based upon a number of other developments. What we would see indicated in the scriptures is a much more rapid development of human institutions in the book of Genesis. People made in God's image are creative, and while there may be developments in different parts of the world that come about, and we can find some evidence of the sophisticated organization of societies and groups of people who are able to live together, what we find is this is something that happens all over the world because people are made in the image of God, and this is part of their response to living in a fallen world. So, as Christians, generally we would see this as being something that's more of a rapid development. We can't tell specifically about things that happened before the flood, as far as how sophisticated things were, but we have some small indications of the sophistication of human society prior to that. And then right after the flood, what we find is that people organize, perhaps to avoid the flood, in building the Tower of Babel. And what we find is that God chose to confuse their languages as a result, and people went off in different directions and developed their own societies. In looking at the development of civilization, many people have looked at geographical contexts as a way to explain why civilizations developed where they did. What you'll notice in your textbook and in various discussions is that there are many people that look towards riverine development of civilizations. They look for civilizations to develop where there are rivers. Now, what we're going to find is that civilizations where you have large groups of people require certain sorts of resources, and certainly water is going to be one of those resources. So I wouldn't think that it's necessary for there to be rivers in order for there to be the development of urban settings and all that might come with that. Another kind of water-oriented theory about the development is the oasis development of civilization, and people might look towards very early archaeological sites that have been excavated, like Jericho, which is an oasis located in the rain shadow of the Judean mountains down in the Great Rift Valley. Water bursts forth from the ground there as springs come forth, and it enables people to live in an area where there's only about 6 to 8 inches of rain per year. But people made in the image of God can respond by cooperating together in a number of different situations. It's not essential that you have a river or an oasis. What we'll find is there'll be other basic sorts of requirements that we'll look for. So as we think about the emergence of civilizations, what we find first of all is we have people who are made in the image of God, who are able to creatively respond to their circumstances. But in order to have urban life where we have large populations that cooperate together, there need to be certain basic sorts of resources. Now as humans, again, there's certain things that we just absolutely have to have, and if we don't have a breath in 30 seconds, we're going to be gasping for air. But generally there's air available for the people to breathe on the surface of the earth. The second we've already pointed towards is water. There needs to be a reliable source of potable water. That is water that can be consumed, whether it comes from a spring or a river or a well. What we'll find is that people are going to be able to find water, and this will be something that's very important, is to be able to get access to water. And learning to dig wells is one of those sorts of things that happens in some places, as the ground can filter the water and provide a uncontaminated source of drinking water for people to consume. The third item that you find yourself needing, you don't find it quite as immediately as in 30 seconds you need air, or within a couple hours you need water. Within a couple days you're going to need to have food. Certainly having sustained food resources that can keep you going are going to be very important. And growing food being able to harvest food from plants that you haven't necessarily planted is going to be something that people will depend upon. To have plants that you can preserve and keep for when the produce is not in season is going to also be important. And so what we're going to find is that growing certain kinds of plants are going to enable people to have the calories they need to exist in this world in order to feed their families, to be healthful, to have children that survive and thrive. We just have to have food. And there's different sorts of food. Again, we might be able to go foraging ourselves at different times. This can be one strategy that we take, is we just eat off the land. And there's some people that still do this today. Even here in the United States, we find that some people subsist off the land in places like the difficult circumstances of Alaska, where people catch fish and go hunting and live off the land. But most people are going to find it to be advantageous to grow food, particularly food that they can preserve over time. And there's different ways that people creatively preserve food. What we're going to find is that there are different kinds of foods in different societies. Some foods might actually be determined to be taboo in one way or the other. And certainly in Western civilization, we're going to be very much influenced by food restrictions that we find in the scriptures, as Judeo-Christian values have shaped some things. We'll find that these may change over time, that your Jewish friends may not eat dairy foods with meats, and they wouldn't eat pork, but yet others in society will eat pork and other food products that some might avoid. Beyond air, water, and food, people need various other resources for living. One of those things would be fuels. In a fallen world where the temperature is not always perfect, where it gets cold, people look to have fuel, not just to keep themselves warm, but also to cook food and prepare food. So this would be an important resource. Other sorts of materials that are needed are things that might be employed in various sorts of crafts, where you might try to change your circumstance. And so materials of a variety of different types are going to be important. As people choose to live together, they need to have shared values. Are they going to protect private property? Is the community as a whole something that individuals will join in protecting? People are going to be looking to have security. In order to do this, they're going to organize in different ways and sometimes recognize some people as having authority. These are the basic sorts of things, the basic resources and developments that are needed for urban life. In order for urban life to develop, though, there are some important technological and cultural developments that seem to be necessary. The first of these would be agriculture. Now, we've already talked about food as being essential for urban life, but you've got to have a steady source of food. And with food production and food gathering, what we find is that there's a number of things that come along with that. First of all, subsisting from the land, there can be food gathering, just collecting resources that are available, things that might be available in the water, like fish, where you can get protein, or carbohydrates, where you can grow various, where you can harvest plants that you haven't necessarily planted yourself, where you might eat, maybe you yourselves have eaten sometime raspberries or blackberries that you've picked in the woods, or you've gone out in the woods and you've picked up nuts that have fallen from trees in the fall, or perhaps you've gone mushroom hunting at some time. Going and gathering food that is naturally occurring, that's out here in creation, is something that we still can do today, and some people find a great deal of joy in doing that. Others find it to be kind of sweaty, and they might get poison ivy along the way. But when you gather food, you have food that you can eat immediately. Sometimes there's ways in which you can preserve food. one of the big issues is going to be how do you store it? How do you keep it? And people in creative response, there's some things you have to eat immediately, otherwise they're going to go bad, and the flies are going to gather. If you have fish, you've got to be able to either dry it or salt it. If you have various other fruits, you need to be able to either dry them or to preserve them in some way. And if you keep things cool, many times things will last longer. If you don't treat some things, they're going to rot on you, so you need to eat them while the eating is good, or have some developed means of keeping the nutrients there for later consumption. So in storing food for people who live in cities, people learn that it's often useful to dry products. So things like grains might be stored in pits that are kept dry, and that you can keep the vermin out of, whether it's mice or other animals might choose to eat it, or insect life that might destroy the nutrient value of things like moths or worms and the like that might eat something. And so if you can store something, you can have it for later. And sometimes in the process of storing things, there's certain concentration that take place as you dry items. For example, if you dry fruit, you can take raisins, and if you dry them, you take grapes, of course, and you dry them, then you can have raisins. Or if you dry plums, you can have prunes. And what you have is a concentration of the sugars, and the nutrient value is preserved along with the vitamins and other nutrients that are there that can benefit people. But when you're just going out gathering food, you have to work pretty hard to do that, and you're never quite sure what all you're going to find. Whereas when in agriculture, people can very quickly move into producing food. And what we find in Genesis is that people, as a creative response to a fallen world, very quickly were engaged in food production. Adam and Eve just merely had to go around the garden eating what God provided. But in a fallen world, food production was something that was important. We find that Cain was engaged in agriculture early on, and this is something that people would continue to do after the flood. As you determine what foods you want to grow, some people see there as being an agricultural revolution where people become sedentary, where they stay in the same spot and they produce enough food to live in that spot where they can survive the change of seasons. And this is an important development in societies, that people would be able to produce enough food for themselves to live in a place in an ongoing manner. Now, as you do that, you might choose to produce crops that have advantages to you, that have large heads as opposed to small heads. Those would be the things that you'd want to plant again. And so there's going to be some selection that takes place on the part of the person planting seeds because they want to get the best crop that they can. This is a creative response to a fallen world. But it takes work. It takes hard work, and sometimes there's frustrations. When you take a seed that could be nourishing you and you plant it in the ground, you bury it, you're going to lose it. But the question is, will you gain more as a result? Planting food and raising crops is a creative response that we find from very early on in human society. Now, as we read on in Genesis, what we find is that animal domestication is something that happens early, with Abel raising flocks. This is something as God gave people animals for food. There's food as animals can convert vegetation into proteins in their muscles that humans can consume, and they can provide us with other useful materials along the way. An animal can eat certain kinds of crops, and with its biology, it can digest certain kinds of plants that humans can't digest. And so as plants grow and animals consume them, animals can take the energy from the plants and build their bodies, and humans can benefit from either the milk or the meat that animals produce. Animals can also produce such things as fibers, like wool or hair on a goat, wool on sheep or hair on a goat, or various kind of other animals that can be spun into thread and woven into cloth. And animals also produce hides that would be leather, that can be made into leather, and can be used to provide covering for people and material from which various types of tools can be made. So animal domestication is an important development that people depend upon along the way. Animals can forage on a steep hillside where you can't grow crops, and from those animals you can gain meat proteins or the nutrient values that come with milk. And while milk may spoil very quickly, what we're going to find is that people early on learn to make various types of products from dairy materials. So you can turn milk into yogurt, for example, or you can make cheeses, and these are able to be stored for a long term. And then you can use those materials at a later time when perhaps there's a dearth of resources available to you. In developing urban settings, people develop the use of fire. Now, in the Bible, there's no discussion there of where fire came from. Certainly, people can use it from early on. And Pyro Technology can be used to both illuminate circumstances and to create heat that might keep people warm, or heat that can be used to cook food and make foods more palatable as a result. Pyro Technology can also be used to transform various sorts of materials, and we'll find that this will be very important for the transformation of ceramic items, to take clay and to make either bricks or to make containers. So pottery comes from use of clays that are fired at high temperature, and we'll find there's quite an interesting development of that type of technology over time. Another use of fire is in metallurgy, making tools. What we find in the book of Genesis is that the forefather of those who are metallurgists was a fellow by the name of Tubal-Cain. When we have metal tools, we can overcome some of our physical limitations. People do not have the sharpest of teeth and the strongest of nails on their fingers, but with metal we can make tools that help us to overcome something of our limitations. Beyond various pyrotechnologies, people also make structures, and architecture is something that develops using locally available materials. And what we find is that amongst the materials that we find evidenced as far as use would be people using rocks to build shelters, and people using naturally occurring shelters such as caves. In caves, people can live and still live today, where they find warmth and shelter from the rains in the winter, and shelter from the sunshine during the summer. But people can make shelters for themselves, and the way that they build things is sometimes something that is culturally defined. Sometimes it's something by the circumstance of what's available. So here, where I live in eastern North Carolina, historically there's been a lot of wooden construction because there's a lot of wood available. Whereas you go to some other place that don't have wood available, they're going to find other resources. And what we're going to find early on in the Near East is the use of mud bricks. And even today we continue to use bricks that are fired, and they're able to resist the wind and the rain. And it's not just the three little pigs that can find shelter, it's us who find shelter today. As people live together, sometimes there's competition for resources. In those circumstances, this is where it's important that laws develop, and people recognize property rights. Who has access to resources? When is it permissible to use resources? And laws are a fundamental development of urban settings in a fallen world. Now, what we find in the scriptures is that there's certain laws that are innate to people. That's not something that's widely accepted in Western civilization, but that there would be something of a knowledge of God that might be embedded within us, and a recognition that other people are valuable and that it's not our place to take their lives or even to take their stuff. So in the development of society, it's important that there would be laws. And what we're going to be looking at is the laws that develop over time in different places. Now, we've talked a lot about civilization and the what all is necessary for there to be civilization. And in your textbook, what you found is that there's been a lot of discussion about the age of the earth. And we don't know exactly how old the earth is. If God used a lot of miracle and the earth is very, very young, then the world may just be about 6,000 years old. But if God used process, then the world would be older. The scriptures don't come right out and tell us exactly how old the earth is, but certainly God has his hand in creation, and Adam is a real person along with Eve, and so the world must be younger than some people think that it is. But there's a whole lot of faith that's involved in the part of people as they look towards the past. There's a lot of interpretation of evidence along the way. And so as we look at the past, we recognize that people are made in the image of God. They're valuable. That part of their creative response to living in a fallen world is that they band together and try to survive in groups. And sometimes those groups come in competition with each other, and sometimes there's conflict that happens in a fallen world. But as we look at civilizations, people who live in certain ways together, and we evaluate civilizations, there are some people along the time who would say civilization is inherently good. It's good to be civilized. You don't want to be a barbarian. To be a person who can get along with others would be something that would make you good. But everybody hasn't always seen civilization as being something that's good. As we move into a time period that's sometimes considered the Enlightenment, some people saw civilization as being bad. They thought that people living naturally were inherently good, and that natural people would be better than civilized people. And so civilization was something that was inherently bad. In a fallen world, civilization is something of a benefit to us. And yet all civilizations aren't equal. Certainly they're different. But in today's world, lots of people want to say that all civilizations are equally valid and good. But what we're going to find is that there are differences amongst them. We want to understand those differences. Now, in studying Western civilization, some people have chanted along the way here in the last couple of decades, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. The thought is that Western civilization is somehow inherently ethnocentric. But Western civilization is something that has some essential components that are rejected by some people. As I see Western civilization, I find amongst its essential components what we might consider a Jewish ontology. Now, this is not something that's essentially only Jewish, but certainly in the Hebrew Bible, we find that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Everything has its origins, its being, because of God. The world is a real world, and we are answerable to God. This is an essential component of Western civilization that many people disdain, because they don't want to be answerable to God. They want to be their own gods. This has been the temptation since the beginning in the Garden of Eden. But as I look at Western civilization, certainly Judeo-Christian values are at the core of Western civilization, and those things are at the core of what many people in the world would reject. As I see Western civilization, I see it beginning here with a Jewish ontology, being developed over time by various other contributing factors like Greek reason, Roman organization, and Christian soteriology. Western civilization is made up of a number of different things, and it stands in contrast to various other civilizations. You might think about Eastern civilizations. One of the differences between them would be, is the world real? Is the physical world real? And people traditionally in Western civilization have believed that the physical world is really real. It's something that God created, He brought into existence, and it's real. And it's something that we can understand. God Himself is real. So this will be something that's fundamentally different between different civilizations, would be their view of existence, their view of how we know about things. Can we know things? The way they organize things, their view of where we're going. Western civilization has a number of essential components. I believe these essential components come from Hebrew ontology. That would be what we learned from the Old Testament about the fact that God is and that God created, that the world is real. I think that Western civilization is greatly shaped by Greek reasoning, by Roman organization, by Christian soteriology and other values, and finally by European synthesis, where all these four earlier things are put together in Europe. Here in America, we've adopted a great deal of Western civilization. We might argue that we have our own civilization, but the people that you generally interact with here in the United States are traditionally very much shaped by Western civilization. As there's an increasing number of immigrants from other places, they come and they sometimes bring their cultural baggage with them, and they may not always come from a Western perspective. As a result, their values will be different, the way they look at the world will be different, and this will sometimes lead to conflicts. But it's important for us to understand who we are and the people with whom we interact. And so I trust that this study in Western civilization will be valuable to you, and that this discussion here today on the origins of civilization will be something that you might reflect upon as you pursue this study further. As we embark on various discussions here in our discussion sessions, I'd have you think about what makes you different from other people of the world. In the Spielvogel textbook that you've been reading, you found a whole lot of discussion about the first humans, and you see something of his understanding of human origins is coming about through a materialistic evolution over a very, very long duration of time. This is something that would be reflective of many people's view in Western civilization today, people who are materialists. Again, within Western civilization, there are several streams that exist, and Spielvogel's view would be that the world is very, very ancient. As Christians, we'd recognize there's a time before the existence of the world. The Bible doesn't give us a specific chronology. Some Christian people have ascribed to a world being about 6,000 years old. Your instructor doesn't know how old the earth is. It's possible, if God created the world with apparent age, that the world could just be 6,000 years old. God, who's almighty, can speak, and the world can come into existence even while we're taking this course, if that's what He'd choose to do. But I don't think that's what He would do, because that would be a matter of God creating the world with evil in it, and that's not who He has revealed Himself to be. So as we look at the world, there's different chronometers used, different clocks that people use to measure various things. And as I engage in archaeological work, I'm interested in processes, and I see that various sorts of things deteriorate at certain rates or change at fairly uniform sorts of rates in the world that we live in right now. But the presumption, as people use many of these different clocks, is that things have always been the way that they are now. And so as a result, if there's a rate of decay where rain erodes certain rocks and develops topsoil, or certain concentrations of mineral salts in bodies of water like oceans, that you could turn that clock back at the current rate of decay and come up with an age of the earth. This is an assumption that things have always remained uniformly as they are today. This sort of uniformitarianism is something that is very, very dangerous. Because as we observe in the world around us, we live in a world that is quite dynamic, and there are sometimes dramatic changes. Something we find in the book of Genesis that was certainly a dramatic event is the flood. I can't tell you what all exactly a cataclysmic worldwide flood would do. Certainly we have the flood revealed to us in scriptures, and there are many things that we look at in the world that we would attribute to the action of water, as we look at certain sedimentary rocks, for example. But we just don't know how all things have been working. So as I deal with textbooks like Spielvogel, we need to understand that he's somebody who comes from the perspective that the world is something that's developed over time. He shares with us the view that the world is real and that there's evidence that we can understand. But sometimes people go beyond their capacity and make leaps along the way. So for myself, as I look at these early artifacts that come from people that may be found in various layers of soil that can be dated in different ways, we need to understand that sometimes our clocks are not carefully calibrated. Sometimes people use carbon dating. The half-life of carbon-14 is just nice round numbers, around 5,000 years. But it's hard to calibrate that, and we don't know that the rate of decay has always been what it is. There are other radioactive clocks that are used that people employ, and we don't know exactly whether those rates of decay have always been the same. But it's through those sorts of things that you get these dates for bones as being 2 million years old and the like. When bones are found under certain other things that are dated in various ways. There's a whole lot that we don't know. But what we do know as Christian people is that God created the world and that He's created processes. And so as we look at various evidence, we have insight that sometimes the world is rejected, and as a result, they're left wondering about why they're here. This is something that we know as Christians, is there's purpose in our existence, and we're going someplace. We're made to have fellowship with God. We're made in His image. We can have fellowship with Him, and this is what He aspires for us, is that we would have a fellowship with Him for eternity. And this is what we look towards even here in this fallen world. And it's part of the abundant life that we can have as we're united with Christ as Christians even now. I pray that in our discussion of Western civilization that you'll think further about the society in which you live, and that your faith might grow, that God is at work in time and space, and that He uses individuals, and that He can use individuals like you in His purposes. May God bless you in your continued studies.